I'm Dan Rockmore, Director of the Neukom Institute for Computational Science here at Dartmouth College. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Neukom Institute Literary Arts Awards, the first of what I hope will be a regular event at Dartmouth, where we recognize great recent creative achievements in speculative fiction. I'd like to recognize first the generosity of Bill Neukom, former trustee of the college and Dartmouth class of 1964, whose extraordinary generosity has made possible the Neukom Institute and with that the Literary Arts Awards program. The label speculative fiction is a relatively recent invention, but work of this kind goes back well over 100 years with seminal works from authors such as Mary Shelley, Jules Verne, and H.G. Wells. Wells called such works, quote, fantasias of possibility, end quote, wherein the writer, quote, takes some great creative tendency or group of tendencies and develops its possible consequences into the future. This is an expansive characterization for a genre that is as shape-shifting as much of the literature it comprises. It accounts for all manner of stories that push the boundaries of the possible. Such work is exceedingly important for the windows into the world that it opens to us. This is surely what Arthur C. Clarke had in mind when he said, quote, the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. Speculative fiction is often the vehicle in which we make that journey. Often, although not always, such work is fueled by imagined futures of technology and science. This was, in fact, the impetus for the Neukom Institute's founding of the awards that we are celebrating today. The mission of the Institute is to support broadly work in computational science, and it has become increasingly clear, at least to me, that artistic work that explores the possibilities for technology, both good and bad, is as important, or at least differently important, as the work that directly develops or exploits such technologies. These awards in the literary arts, as well as a related award for playwriting, speak to and recognize that critical perspective, and in particular, the power of great writing to create worlds that enable us, the readers, to explore the liminal space between the possible and the impossible, and in so doing, allow each of us to reflect on whether or not these are the worlds we want to build or perhaps have already built. Each of our award-winning authors have produced masterful and thought-provoking works, ultimately selected by our judge, the New York Times best-selling author, Maria Headley. So Maria, thank you. Maria worked from a very strong shortlist constructed after a good deal of debate by myself and my Dartmouth colleagues, Professor Alex Chi from Creative Writing and Professor Tarek El-Aris from Middle Eastern Studies. It's my pleasure to now introduce you to these inaugural recipients of the Neukom Institute Literary Arts Awards. Their award, I've done this before and I give people a box and everyone in the audience thinks, what the hell is in that box? So so we do have these lovely mementos that I'll give you later, but just to show you, there is something here. So including this. So first off, in the category of debut speculative fiction, I'm pleased to introduce to you Juan Martinez, who's receiving the Neukom Institute Literary Arts Award for his short story collection, Best Worst American. Juan? In the open category, I'm pleased to be able to give 2 awards this year. First, to Corinne Daubis for her novel On the Edge of Gone. And another award goes to Levi Tidar for his novel Central Station. Unfortunately, logistics snafus will mean that Levi will be here, but probably not until the end, unfortunately, of the panel that we're about to have. So there's much to say about the works of these authors and the genre generally, and that will be the subject of our panel now. So I'm going to turn things over to Maria Headley, who has graciously agreed to chair the panel. I should also say that Maria has written an extraordinary new book, The Mere Wife, which I quite enjoyed, which I happily recommend to everyone. So Maria, thanks for being here, and I'm going to shift it off all to you.
Thank you.
All
Okay, these mics are okay. I'm just gonna, normally I'd be like clinging to it and worrying about you all, but if you don't hear me, just hand up. So I got to judge this prize. It was amazing. It was a short list of, actually I'm just going to read the short list to you because it was thrilling. After Atlas by Emma Newman, Children of the New World by Alexander Weinstein, Made for Love by Alyssa Nutting, New York 2140 by Kim Stanley Robinson, 6 Wakes by Mur Lafferty, Telling the Map by Christopher Rowe, Using Life by Ahmed Naji, and Void Star by Zachary Mason, along with the winners here. And it was such a beautiful experience to receive this list of 11 books that were so diverse and so full of thrilling imaginings of the world to come and of the world that we are currently living in, which I think is as relevant to the building of both of a future and of an imaginative way of increasing our possibilities for life on this planet as anything to deeply look at what the kind of world we have. So this was a wonderful experience. It was lots and lots of pages, and I got to the end of them with 3 winners, and the winners were all thoroughly brilliant. I felt really privileged to get to judge this prize. So I'm going to read to you just a very short thing that I wrote to Dartmouth when I chose the winners, and I'll read a little bit about each of these books so that you have a sense, because I assume most of you have not read these books, and you should. So I'm just going to read just a little thing. Central Station is a book spanning many lives, giving us perspectives of characters ranging from Robotniks, part human, part robot, bearing the scars of wars long forgotten, to a child seeking his father who has gone off among the stars, to an unwilling data vampire in female form, trying to find her place in space. It's lyrically written, physically grounded, and often heart-wrenching, while still managing to be a technically assured portrait of a world that is one of the logical conclusions of our own technology and science, a place wherein information is rendered sustenance, and where the grit of our own history is entwined with an intimately imagined future. It's a brilliant achievement, both as a novel constructed in fragments and as a map of extremely diverse experiences across a culture still engineered of the broken bits of its past. The conversation, a universal data and knowledge pool which nearly all the characters in this book participate in through nodes, is only a step beyond our current love affair with information. And Tidar's imagining of an ability to connect with anyone, anywhere, to immerse in story and in statistics, in all the libraries of the world, in secrets and in dreams, is a tender vision of the future, rather than a dystopian one. On the Edge of Gone deals in family, both chosen and blood, in the aftermath of a tremendous comet striking the Earth. Denise, the protagonist, is a keenly portrayed 16-year-old girl trying to hold her family together and move them into the future while learning new skills and pushing herself to the limit. This is a book filled with diversity, deeply felt characters, incredibly high stakes, and profound community in the wake of catastrophe. Corinne Devis, I do not know how to pronounce your last name. Any attempt? I realized I had failed to ask a very key question before I sat down here. Brings characters I haven't seen on the page before into clear focus. Her protagonist is an autistic girl of color, and we see the world from her perspective. This work places us in the loss of our known world and in the exchange of what we know for what we can hardly imagine. And her protagonist is uniquely skilled to assess the changing world around her. It is an intense, enlightening, important read. Best Worst American is a short story collection, which gives us bite-sized pieces of a lot of lives, many of them humorous in tone, but striated with pain, loss, and longing, with the kind of magic that feels familiar, with talking plants and girl ghosts, unresponded communications, marital secrets. It's a catalog of possibility. Each of these stories urges engagement with narrators whose dreams are not necessarily ones we'd empathize with, but whose underlying motivations, the search for love and connection, are written across all of us. These are stories about being displaced in a world that hasn't accounted for your basic needs, and they are also stories about seeking fulfillment in unusual places. The future here, as well as the present, are depicted as replete with information, with untold stories and with whispered hopes. The book concludes with a refusal to let go, with 2 people holding on tight, and the entirety is based on this notion, however flawed the participants, however dark the disasters between them. So all of these books had just deeply human grounding in emotion, in longing, in love, in relationships between each other, which was a really interesting place to begin in thinking about this as a speculative fiction and as a futuristic fiction prize, the idea that we would still remain people who love other people, was for me the unifying theme, the theme of constantly reaching out, and I guess Only Connect, it's the theme of many things, but it was definitely the theme of the winners of this prize. So I'd like to get started with just asking a few questions of my panelists about how they came to write in this genre. This genre is such a wide and sprawling category, as I think we're all aware. One of these is a young adult novel. This is a short story collection. Livy's book is set in a futuristic Israel. But how did you come to think not the daily reel? How did that begin for you?
That's a good question. Oh, so I didn't realize that I was networking outside of the reel, partly because I was writing about Orlando and Las Vegas, and some of the parts of the story that are the weirdest and strangest are the parts that are absolutely 100% true, right? They're weird towns. But one thing that I realized is that when I was in Colombia, I read a lot of Asimov, and then when my parents got to Orlando, I made my birthday present was that they give me a subscription to Asimov's. And so like a lot of like my early connection to the short story form was there. It was in those like the 4-year length of just monthly installments of Asimov's. So it was like there was a very definite infusion, I think, of the future.
And were you reading, I'm not sure what was in Asimov's at this time, this is the 80s?
It would have been like the late 80s and 90s, so it would have been, I can list like a bunch of people, because when Gardner Dozois, the editor of Asimov's, died, I sort of went back and I had all the issues in my office because I had refused to get rid of them. And I pulled out an issue at random, and it was Maureen McHugh was in it with this really strange story about an alternate history of like a bicycle delivery person, but he was working for the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire was still going on. And there's a Jeff Vandermeer story. I think it was like literally his first story that was published. It was just a random issue. But I mean, I think it was mostly like Nancy Kress was somebody who was like huge for me at that moment, and James Patrick Kelly, the guy who did Mr. Boy, would have been in there. Yeah, there's a lot of people I was reading, and then I went off. I did, got an MA, got a PhD in literature, and I was writing what at the time I was thinking of as my own kind of brand of like weird stuff, but I don't think realizing how much of it was just being informed by a lot of very early formative reading.
Awesome.
For me, it was also very much what I grew up reading. Like, as a very young child, I loved Goosebumps, except, of course, translated into Dutch, since that's where I grew up. And there was also fiction like Animorphs. That was my favorite series growing up. I loved it. And also some Dutch science fiction authors, mostly horror, fantasy. And I just loved that throughout my entire childhood. When I became a teenager, it turned more to X-Men type fiction. So for me, it was never really a question of what I was going to write. Like when I knew I was going to write a book, it was always going to be some flavor of sci-fi or fantasy. And so my first novel was fantasy. This one is very firmly sci-fi. The one I've got coming out next year, I'm still not quite sure after 3 years of working on it. So it's some strange blend of them. It's just a genre I've always liked because there's so many possibilities. I remember trying to explain to my granddad at one point why I wrote this. Because he would be the type... He never really understood science fiction or fantasy. I remember we watched Iron Man with him, and he loved the beginning, like all the military stuff, and that was fantastic. And then the suit started happening. He just walked out of the room, like completely lost his interest. And I remember explaining to him, like, all the things that we currently deal with, you can explore those in science fiction and fantasy in a more magnified way, or in a way that might become clear to people who wouldn't otherwise understand it. For like a couple of themes that I deal with in the novel is about, like, how human lives are valued, and particularly which human lives are valued. And that's something that's very relevant in our current society. And of course, the very on-the-nose maybe way to explore it is by having an apocalypse and a generation ship, and they have to choose who gets to be on the generation ship to flee the planet. And that's something I really love when you read sci-fi, and it can be all kinds of exciting new inventions or worlds or just explosions, which are also great fun. It can be anything from character-driven or action-based. And in the end, you realize, like, oh, actually, none of what I just read could happen in our world, and all of what I just read still applies to our world. And that's something I just really love to explore.
I was thinking as I was reading these books about as when I was a child and I was reading science fiction, I always thought my grandfather had a subscription to Asimov's, and I thought, well, these must be the solutions. This must be a solution Bible for how to fix the problem. And as Reagan was president, I thought, okay, these must be things that will fix Reagan. And that was not the case usually. But I think about our current life on Earth, and reading your books, there were many elements of. There were many solutions. I found these books very hopeful. They were full of recognition of people who are not currently being recognized in our societies in every kind of way. And I think that this list of winners is the same thing. It's people who are in American circles often not as recognized. It's a very international crew here, and people who did not grow up in America, people who are writing from traditions that are not wholly the traditions of the American golden age of science fiction. I would like to talk to you guys a little bit about how you see the role of science fiction and speculative fiction as the new myths. Like, do you see your work as writing a new myth cycle for our future? In terms of, like, I mean, it's an obnoxious question. It's like, do you think your work is going to last? But I personally specialize in, I just wrote an adaptation of Beowulf, so I've been thinking a lot about the stories that we keep telling and the ways that we change the stories as writers in this present moment.
Go for that one.
Go for that big question.
No pressure. That's honestly not something I could say I've ever really given much thought to, but it is. I do find it a fascinating question, because so much of what we now consider sci-fi has sort of entered the canon, but the longer the genre goes on, obviously the more books get written, which ones get added to the canon, which ones last in our collective imaginations. Because at this point, you can say Frankenstein, and most people will think of the monster, the figure, rather than the book itself. Mm-hmm. It's gone past the original story and become a concept of its own. I don't think that's quite as likely to happen with my work, but for me, I don't think I really focus much on, like, what it could be in the future, and more even though it's a book about the future, it's very much in conversation with the books that have been published about this topic in the past. Mm-hmm. I've always been a fan of apocalyptic fiction of all kinds, whether it's just, like, even in the movie 2012, I just really liked seeing everything get very destroyed. But also because of all the themes you can explore. And one of the things that always bothered me in pretty much all kinds of apocalyptic stories, whether you're talking about a comet impact or an alien invasion, or ecological disaster, any kind of zombie apocalypse, you really don't get to see certain characters. And in particular, the group that I focus on most with my novel is disability. You don't get to see disabled characters in apocalyptic fiction very often. And a lot of the time people explain that's, obviously they wouldn't have survived anyway. Or if you do see the character, they will heroically sacrifice themselves to support the people who have a better chance of survival. And that's something that's always rather bothered me. And just this unspoken assumption, because often it's not even explicitly stated in the book. You just don't see disabled people at all. And that's something I very much wanted to challenge. Like, okay, but is that really the case? Like, disabled people are not all going to disappear. And they're not all going to suddenly die in the very first wave, because there's kind of a lot of us. So what happens? Why would they not be featured? Who makes these decisions? And how fair and how correct are these decisions? And that's not something I necessarily have answers for, because as with all questions of if you have to choose someone to survive, who gets to survive, it's complicated. But it is something I very, very much wanted to question and discuss in a way, because it's not something I ever saw discussed. I just wanted to raise a topic like, hey, can we start thinking about this? So even if my novel doesn't really survive to become, survivor for another 100 or 200 years, I do hope that those kinds of ideas will survive, that we start questioning the assumptions that we have, even in our futuristic fiction. Because our future, there's a lot of imaginings of what our future could be like or is likely to be like. And a lot of it is very depressing, and it can be very cold and very skeptical and very cynical. And while I understand part of that, I also really, really just want to see, like, hey, can we actually be more optimistic? Is it possible to have an apocalypse where people actually try to help each other survive instead of bashing each other's brains in order to survive themselves? And that's something that I definitely hope we will see more of in all kinds of these sorts of questions or all kinds of genres. Just talk a little bit more like, hey, what could the future be, and be a little less cynical about that sort of thing. I may have veered completely off topic at this point.
No,
but
I think that's very on topic. I was going to ask a brief follow-up about writing for young adult fiction, because of course you are raising another generation as you're writing the books. Like you're creating a readership that becomes the next generation of voters, that becomes the next, that's how I think about it. I write revolutionary YA myself, often trying to provoke political action. And I think that when you have readers who are started on the young end of the spectrum, that's something that you can actually see happening in your readership, which is a pleasure to and also to have characters like yours that are really very infrequently depicted in science fiction for younger readers and for older readers. My dad. So I was thinking about this with your book specifically about both bearing witness and creating new models for young readers, particularly in a climate of the world in which we are very close to every certain kind of apocalypse, so many different kinds of apocalypse. We have our fingertips touching right now. So the idea of preventing these things is with everyone, but especially with the young, and keeping the world alive for growing up into is something that your book is really about.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff you put into a novel that you think about, but that doesn't actually get explicitly mentioned in the novel, and I always like it when people notice those things. So sometimes I'll read a review and someone mentions something, I'm like, yes, that is exactly what I was trying to do. And something that I read in a recent review was that someone really liked that the people who decided to fight for the planet and fight for survival and band together in communities are largely the young and the disenfranchised, because these are the people who have mostly had to build community in our current world and are most, in some ways, are more equipped to deal with this kind of disaster because they've already had to deal with various kinds of survival their whole lives. And right now, kids and teenagers growing up today are also having to deal with a whole lot of different kinds of disasters, whether you're talking about political disasters, or global warming, or violence that happens in schools and pretty much everywhere. Mm-hmm. And you can tell, I think, that teenagers are very much becoming more aware of this and becoming angry about it. And that's something I really like to see, obviously, because I think that's really good. And that people, especially when they're picking up on that so young, because I do think that what you read or see happening in the world around you when you're very young will influence a whole lot of how you consider these topics when you're older. So the more of these kinds of books, I think, not necessarily mine, but just books that question the status quo and like, hey, could this be better? I think that definitely can influence a ton. I can't think of examples right now, of course, but I definitely know like books that I read when I was young. Sometimes a single line in a single book just completely changed my worldview. And actually, those Animorphs book, I saw you nodding, they were really good about that because they explored so many complicated issues of survival and trauma and war and sacrifice. And those definitely got me to start thinking about things I wouldn't have otherwise thought about, except this time it was because I was reading about kids who turned into animals to fight aliens.
With really cool covers.
With really cool covers.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely something that I'm aware of as I'm writing it. I try not to let it influence me to the extent that it becomes didactic or anything, or that I'm trying to achieve a certain goal, because it does still need to be about the story. But it does influence how I think about these things. And that in itself will influence the story, even if it's not directly.
It was interesting reading these books. I was thinking about Lord of the Flies. I was thinking about how Lord of the Flies is kind of the trope for it all goes very badly when we're in a community. We can't do it. We kill each other. We destroy each other. We abuse each other. And these books are not about that. These books are, all of them are about solutions within a community and within communities. And it was really inspiring to read that and to think of that as publishable and deep mythology that continues forward.
In terms of Lord of the Flies, I was actually wondering, I thought I recently read something that the point of that wasn't even necessarily this is what humans are like in this situation, but this is what spoiled white boys from prep schools are like in this situation.
Which, yeah.
Maybe a good point.
And that was the intention of the author even specifically. So when there was talk of like a reimagining with Lord of the Flies, but with girls, people were like, but that's not the point. that would look completely different.
They all become Wonder Woman. Okay, it's fine.
Ooh, that would be pretty cool.
That'd be cool.
I would read that.
That somehow reminds me of like another book that I read when I was really young, and it was 2 Years Vacation by Jules Verne, where kids get shipwrecked in an island, and then they're fine. And they literally just build a community, figure out what to do, and then they make their way through for 2 years. It was awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the idea that story can only be found in agony, in interpersonal agony, I think is a wrong idea. There's plenty of agony just set up and waiting for you on every curb, you know?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be doom and gloom.
It doesn't have to be we're awful to each other and therefore.
Yeah, I see a lot of students, some of them have been sort of maybe here under duress. I don't know if you're under duress. I'm just saying like there's actually a lot of students.
Some of whom are chained to their chairs.
Chained to their chairs. But I was going to say that if any of them are writers, or imagine that there's a lot of students here who are writers, because you mentioned myths, and one of I think the things that really helped me crack something in my writing was the moment that I realized that I did not have to make up a story from whole cloth, that I could borrow the elements or the dynamics of a plot from bigger stories that had existed before, that had been there for a long, long time. And that was enormously helpful. So I just thought I'd throw it out there in case anybody is in a creative writing class right now and is trying to figure out how to get your person from point A to point B and just like steal somebody else's myth. And
what did you steal from?
Oh my God! I have in that. I just realized it's like myth and fable, and I just realized it's like it's an exploitation movie from the 70s by David Cronenberg. The Brood. I stole from David Cronenberg's The Brood for a story about Las Vegas. There's somebody commissioned like, hey, putting this anthology together, it's like Las Vegas horror, and it's like, I mean, immediately, yeah, of course, Las Vegas horror, yes, right? That's natural fit. And then I didn't really know what I wanted to write about, and then I was watching a lot of David Cronenberg, because people, like if you've seen The Fly, but one of my favorite movies by him is The Brood, which has a lot of creepy EST 70s, a lot of earth tones. But it also has, and I'm sorry, I just realized this is a great movie, and then I'm going to give out like the coolest thing about it, which is that one of the central characters in this has rage babies. She basically channels her entire rage, and they turn into these infants that just go out into the world full of rage. And that's what I stole from, it's like I'm just gonna have some rage babies in Las Vegas. I don't know why. So some of it should be doom and gloom, right? Like some of it should be rage babies.
I mean, there are plenty of rage babies wandering among us.
I think there's a lot of us have rage babies gestating right now, yeah.
So what do you think about, in your own work, what do you think about, what were the myths that shaped you into a man who writes? Because lots of your stories are flash fiction. They're little fables.
They are little fables, yeah.
That's how I felt reading them. And I guess we had a long talk in the car yesterday, which was very exciting for us both because we were across every possible topic, ranging from Greek fire to female cult leaders.
You can say female cult leaders again, yeah.
Yeah. So, but I think you and I have in common that we think of ourselves as politically active writers, as people who are trying to change the world with our work. So what are you trying to change?
Well,
what's
I mean,
the dream?
right now there's some very direct things that I'd like to change that have to do with the entire current administration, right? They should not be there, right? That's
They should just go,
they should obviously
erase.
go away,
Yeah.
right? But that's a very direct kind of thing. And in some ways it's kind of strange to try to move away from that into like the more abstract ideas that I think I had in the project, but a lot of them had to do with, I was an international student when I came to the US, and didn't have a car, and I was a student, so I didn't have a lot of money, and if you were on an F1 visa as a student in the US, you can't work more than 20 hours, So I spent a lot of time walking, being on buses, and I think one of the things that really sort of dawned on me early on is how invisible you are if you're just walking, how weird and anomalous it is just to not have a car, and how immediately that makes you suspect as a human being, and how none of the people that I met in buses were any less weird, or, well, they were weird, but they were weird in way more interesting ways than the people who are just out riding their cars, right? So I guess one of the things that happened is just, okay, there's a huge disparity between people who have the means to be in a car and the people who don't. And there's this incredible artificial separation between if you've got money and if you don't. And a lot of that, ultimately, I think we talked about him, I'm a huge fan of the writer George Saunders, and he was sort of the first people whom sort of I found writing really movingly and powerfully about the experience of being broke, or being afraid to go broke, right? Or just having the feeling of how money can weigh down on you in one way or another. So that's one of the political sides of what happened there.
It's an interesting notion. I was thinking as I was preparing for this, that the notion of writing about the future is always also about writing about the past, and what you're saying in that is essentially industrial age, class hierarchy, shifting with automobiles, with buses, with the idea that you have a barrier between yourself and other people, that makes you have a higher class status and less engagement with society, which of course is what leads to problems of disastrous personal dystopia. Like apocalypses of one, which is what the whole culture seems to be engaging in right now. Yeah. And I felt like a lot of your book was about loneliness and about the difficulties of not being able to get through the barricades that have been placed between your characters and the rest of the world. In one case, an executive vaults over an outhouse door that is stock shot.
In Colombia, that's actually a true story that I heard from my uncle. I was like, this is just a great story. I have to capture it. Yeah, a lot of the stories are about disconnection, and what I hope is like a real sincere effort of people to try to find some form of connection between each other. and they don't always succeed, but I always like them because they're trying, right? Which is, I think, something that I'm just talking about them like they're abstractions, but that's very much me. I'm a weirdo, and then I try to, it's always nice you find fellow weirdos, right? That always makes it really good, but you also just try to connect to everybody, right? You try to be open and, yeah.
Nice. Yeah. So when I got this assignment to judge this prize, we were talking, Dan and I talked on the phone, we were talking about the capacity to imagine far beyond the possible as a scientist and as someone working in any kind of science. The idea that you would have a hypothesis that might seem absolutely implausible, and that you could potentially grow your imagination to meet the boundaries of that hypothesis, and then to be able to prove something that seems like there's just no way to get there from here. And one of the things about these books and about writing speculative fiction as a whole, one of the great privileges of it, I think, is that you get to prove the impossible all the time. You get to stretch your own imagination beyond, and then go, this is what I want to have happen. How can I make it happen? How can I make it seem plausible? So I wanted to talk to you both a little bit about notions of world building, about notions of how do you create a world that feels that the impossible can happen within it. Technical question.
Well, for this particular book, I tried to do the opposite, because I tried to create a world that was very much possible. Mm-hmm. I knew I needed an apocalypse, and I considered all kinds of apocalypses. Like, I considered, is it going to be a common impact, which ended up being the winner, but I also considered alien invasion and all kinds of other things. And I ended up settling on common impact because, in a way, it was the most straightforward, easy to understand, because I very much wanted the focus to be on the characters and their dilemmas. So even though the book is set in 2035, so sometime in the future, there is some new technology that we don't currently have. Mm-hmm. But I purposefully kept that very much to a minimum because I didn't really want to have to distract it from the book in a way. Because the more you have to imagine, like, oh wait, what's this, the more, like, the less it starts to feel like your own world. And I very much wanted people to have the feeling like this is our world, or this could be our world. So I actually downplayed the speculative elements in a way that I don't do with any of my other work for that specific purpose, because I wanted it to feel as relevant and possible as I could. I would have said it in the here and now if it weren't for the fact that I needed generation ships for the plot to work, and we don't currently have generation ships. So that's literally the only reason I decided to set it in the future. So I think for me, that question right now doesn't quite apply.
Does it apply to your other work? Do you have techniques for making a world that are specific to you? What do you do when you sit down to think about it? Do you write the Bible of the world first, or do you invent what you need?
Sort of a little bit of both. I start with some very broad ideas and concepts and things that I want to explore. And the more I write the book, the more that world also starts to form. So it sort of develops alongside the plot, and I will make notes as it develops. I might start with this concept, and as I write, I realize it doesn't work. So I make a note to change that. I continue with the new idea, and later I revise back to make sure everything matches up. So for my first novel, that was partially set in our world and partially set in a secondary fantasy world, I had to come up with all kinds of nations and history for that secondary fantasy world. So I did a whole lot of brainstorming for that, and I wrote down a ton of notes. And in the end, not all of that made it into the book, but I feel like having so much that doesn't make it on the page but is in your head, and then just slipping in details where it's relevant, really helps flesh out a world. Mm-hmm. And I also find that focusing very much on people and their reactions, and particularly the relatable reactions that may not always paint the character in a very flattering light, that helps a lot with making a world feel real. Mm-hmm. And that's also something that I heard about on the Edge of Gone quite a bit, that as outlandish as the destruction might get, that people felt very rooted and connected specifically because you're so deep in the character's head, and that felt that helped, sort of root it more into the familiar.
I think it's this question applies as well to realistic fiction as much as to anything else, because to make a world feel real, it doesn't matter if it's an imaginary world. To make our world feel real is as much technical detail and as much poetic detail, I think, as anything else, which maybe applies a little more to your less futuristic world.
No, I agree. And usually my technique is very similar. I believe in like letting taking the people who we're making up, taking them seriously, taking what they're feeling seriously, and taking what they're going through seriously. One thing that I found enormously helpful, because my stuff can be very strange, is that this idea that you sort of make sure that you're rendering everything as precisely as possible and as accurately as possible, except for this one thing, right? Mm-hmm. So everything's sort of real. So I have a story about plants that talk, and this woman who never ages, right? And she's off screen throughout this whole thing. But it's all happening at the subdivision by a retention pond. So that part of it was totally my subdivision in Orlando when I was living there. And all I had to do is and then I also realized, all right, if the plants are gonna talk, they're just gonna be super self-absorbed, and all they can talk about is themselves. They're just constantly so you should check out my leaves, because they're really beautiful, right? So this idea that what can I do to both amp up the realism of the situation, and just so to get the feelings that are there. But I was also gonna say, one of my favorite quotes from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, he talks about, he has this great moment in Living to Tell the Tale, which is his memoir, and he's talking about reading Kafka's The Metamorphosis, and he, first line, one night Gregor Samsa woke up from troubling dreams to find himself transformed into a giant beetle. And then Garcia Marquez says, oh, you can just do that, right? You can just okay, now he's a giant beetle. Yeah. On with the story, right? So that's another way, I guess. You can also just use your Kafka bulldozer and go for it, right?
Yes. I think that also happens in Levy's book, though he's not here to talk about it. He has things that are wildly from all kinds of traditions in that book, and they feel very mythic and folkloric, but then sometimes there are robots who have folkloric histories. The smell of oranges repeats throughout the book. The idea of a lost orange that places you on Earth consistently repeats as a sentimental and as an emotion cueing motif in those books. And his world building of his futuristic colony is as built by things from our current moment in our world as by anything else. I felt the reality of that world feels extra super real because of the memory of the world that is lost and the world that has reshaped into the world that he's built, nice. which is very interesting, because his bulldozer is here we are deep in this craziness, and there are people from all sorts of invented kinds of people are here from all over the universe, and it's already, you've leapt there, and the temptation I found in reading this, initially I thought, oh no, it's going to be very, very deep world building, and I'm going to be bored, because reading the Dictionary of Beasts makes me bored regularly, and that's not my sort of thing. And then it turns out it's a poem about little scraps of pain and love and lust and longing for a parent. It's very interestingly structured book that does its world building in a very different way than I would have imagined it would in terms of its futuristic narrative.
I want to say one thing I really liked about that book was that the future didn't leave the past behind. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because I think, sometimes when you think about building a future world, it's oh, well, everything that came before has now been completely lost, and it's all gleaming white walls or whatever it is that you're trying to construct. But in that book, you had the dirty streets of Tel Aviv and mm-hmm. all the grime and the markets that are there in the center of the city, which were completely next to this extraordinary spaceport. And you had regular old biological humans like we are, and all the way up through, you know, hybrids to completely robot to digital presences. And they're all there all at once. And so this other world was sort of built in pieces, just as many of the characters were built in pieces, but it was grounded in that it came from our world, and you still saw our world in it. So it wasn't forced to do total heavy lifting to create an entirely new planet, which I really appreciated, because like you, if I'm just thrust into something totally weird and wacky, I find that for me anyway, I lose patience. I like to have these tendrils of connection back to something that I understand.
I think all of these books are as much about long memory as about big imagination of the future. I think that it's all entwined in all of these stories. The idea that there was a world that we've lost parts of, or that, and very recently in the case of your book, and in the case of your book, it's like daily memories that we've lost, daily bits of history that are being obliterated and changed into how will we continue, what are we going to do, whose hand do we take, how do we go forward? And that's an interesting common ground between all of these books, and also writers living in this moment, I think. And with that, I think I'm going to reach my hands out to the audience and see if anybody has any questions. I didn't actually run that by anyone, but I have a feeling someone must have a question. Be brave.
Yes.
There are some mics there if you want to step up and ask something. Here, Christine.
I think in a perfect world, we'd all be buying hardbound books by the truckload at $30 or $40 a piece. But increasingly, we see books being published in electronic form and downloaded to computers and e-readers. And I'm wondering how that affects an author who has to buy tires for the car or send the kids to the dentist or pay for a mortgage. How's that affecting your lives?
I have a good answer for this because my publisher is like literally sitting right here in the front audience. And I think I'm just going to say one thing, which is that he would, I'm sorry, Gavin, I think every publisher has to just don't buy books from Amazon. Just buy books from, just buy books, I guess would be the. But I do feel that I usually read in every format. I read online, I read on my phone, I mean, my favorite thing is to read like nice physical copies, but sometimes you can't. I think I'm gonna read Fear, the Woodward book, probably on the phone just out of shame, right? But I will read it. Just like, don't know why I'm like saying that shame is, it's a Trump erotica, I guess. Yeah, so.
I mean, there was the bit about the bathrobe. That was in the other book, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, I really think that ebooks are a positive thing. I think at this point, like you say, publishers and authors just want people to read books. And the specific format, I don't think we can be very picky about that, because there is so much demanding our attention these days with internet or other media or movies, games, and I'm a fan of all of those, so I know how difficult it can be to balance all of those interests. And for me, having ebooks has made that easier in a way, because it's much easier to have books on the go with me. Right now I'm traveling, and I have to be very careful about not bringing too much or not buying too much, because I'm going to hit my weight limit when I get back. And I just have my e-reader with me with a couple hundred books on there. It makes it much easier when I'm standing in line somewhere. I just grab my phone, I open the ebook that I'm reading, and I can read a couple of pages. So I find that it sort of lowers the barrier to reading in a lot of ways, especially because it's on devices that people are already very familiar with and close to. It also makes it a lot more accessible price-wise, especially because ebooks often will go on a sale, like whether it's a daily sale or a few weeks, and it reaches a price level that most people are able to afford. So it gives access to people who might not otherwise be able to read it unless it were from a library or a used book sale. And it also makes books more accessible for all kinds of disabled people. I have a blind friend, and she is so happy with ebooks because it's the only way she can read books. It allows her to enlarge the letters to a point that she can actually comfortably read it. It means that only a few words will fit on her phone, but she can read it in a way that it doesn't really work with physical books. And she still prefers audiobooks, but those are very limited. Like, not every book gets an audiobook. So I think there's a lot of advantages, and for me, that rather outweighs whether I think the financial impact, because I think it opens up books to more people, that the lower price point sort of gets balanced out. And if I had to choose, I would vastly prefer a larger audience rather than a select audience that's able to buy books for higher prices. But I do still really like having a very pretty hardcover.
Alex?
So this is a little bit of a game, I guess. I'm thinking of, like, I'm wondering if you on the panel have seen something like a weird news item recently that is like a novel that you want somebody else to write. It's a little bit of a, like, so I saw, for example, like Facebook revealed recently that in one of their data centers, there was a cloud that was created in a rainstorm, and it ruined all of these servers. It's just sort of like all happened indoors spontaneously. Is there anything like, do you ever have those kinds of moments? And can you think of something like that?
So, this is a very weird question, Alex, because I've been trying to do this thing where I leave my phone upstairs and I actually read the newspaper or something when I'm eating without the phone. And there was something on the bottom right-hand corner of the Wall Street Journal today that I literally thought this would be a great novel. I have no idea what it is because I was in the middle of eating and then I forgot about it. But it was like a very tiny, very strange story. The most recent one that I can think of that I definitely said I would literally read either a story or a novel is the Wrigley rat, the Wrigley Field rat. So this week in Wrigley Field, the game stopped for a moment because there was a rat that was trying to hop over a fence, and everybody just started cheering for this rat, and the rat just kept trying and trying, but it was a Wrigley Field rat, and it was a very fat rat trying to get over this fence. And I was like, this is, if there's a children's book about the Wrigley Field rat, I would buy this for my 3-year-old immediately.
I have a very similar thing.
For myself.
I would buy it for myself too, yeah.
That sounds amazing.
For my kid.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. I want it. I want your little myth of the rat.
Yeah.
I have a very similar one, which is the fox in the London high-rise that got in the elevator and moved to the very, very top floor of the Shard, I think is the name of this building. It's a terribly, terribly tall, very ugly building, and the fox moved into the top floor. And I have wrangled this piece of news. I think about it sometimes in my sleep. I'm like, can't I just write a novel from the point of view of that fox and the ghost that's there or something? But it seems like a lot to do a novel on that topic in this moment, but it's still I want to read it. I want to know that fox's story. I want to know about living on the top floor above London, looking down at all of the history of London beneath you, and you're just a triumphant fucking fox.
Yeah.
That's the name of the book?
Triumphant fucking fox. Yeah.
I would buy that book.
In a heartbeat, yes.
Alex, I'm sorry, Corinne.
No, I've definitely had those moments, but I'm completely blanking on details, so please go for it.
Whatever's on the bottom right-hand corner of the Wall Street Journal is triumphant. Alex, do you have one? Just because it sounded like the...
Oh, that was the cloud inside the...
The cloud side, yes.
Basically,
that's a good one.
I'm amazed at that. I have no idea what to do with it.
It's luscious, though. Just the notion of it is almost enough to have and just chew for a while. Maybe you could converge it with the fox. The two of them together.
So what advice do you have for a new author trying to set up a new world or world building? Because that seems to be the biggest hurdle right now for a creative project I'm working on.
This is not my advice, and I cannot remember who told me, but I found it fascinating advice that for a secondary world, where does the food come from and where does it go? Which is, where's the food come from, where does it grow, how does it enter the city or wherever, and where does the sewage go? Is there a sewage system, etc.? Just like these two basic questions can really help flesh out the world, because both of them really deal with the very daily practices that everybody has to deal with, but that you're not normally aware of. That's very specific for a secondary fantasy world or a sci-fi world. If you're dealing with a more contemporary world, I think a lot of it for me is just noticing the details. So you can fudge a lot of the bigger question stuff if you know how things would work just for your character. Like, you don't need to know the whole economic system to know that if your character is poor, it's going to affect them in some ways. And it's much more interesting to see what ways those are and how those affect the character, how their experiences might differ, rather than the whole system around it that they might not ever get into contact with. But I still struggle with world building, so I might not be the best person to give advice here.
I was going to go ahead and suggest also Jeff Vandermeer's Wonder Book, which actually has a couple of really, really good chapters on world building. And then like the other sort of, if you are leaning toward the more realistic side of things, I often urge my students to be a little lazy and to not like keep reaching out, but to sort of like, what are some things that you know that you're like deeply familiar with in some ways, and use a variation of that for your own means, so you don't have to work that hard.
I had, a few years ago, I was writing secondary, like, world fantasy sort of mashed together with our world. And it's a world of sky ships, Sky Kingdom, and with sailing ships. And I went to a friend of mine who is a person with a big imagination, and I was like, if you had a world full of sailing sky ships, what's your top ask of like what you would want to have? What creature would you want? And then I just went to all of my biggest imagining friends and said, what's the creature you want? Until I had just a list of creatures, and then I just put them in. It was like an Easter egg collection for all my nerdy friends. But it built the world for me. Like the like one line of, here's a world that has sailing ships and it's above our head. What would be in that world for you? Because everybody has a different idea. So that's like one tool. It's the community-sourced version. But the non-community sourced version for world building for me is always break the story you want to tell down into the one-page version, the one-paragraph version, and the one-line version. And then all you need in the world building is what you have to have in that one sentence, really. Like, you need a world that can, where that story can take place, and you don't need all of the details of the whole, every level of everything. You just need, a series of objects, basically. And once you have a series of objects, you can move them around. So I think like the deep dive world building approach, which does work for some people write all the beasts and the names of them. You don't have to do that. If that's what you're getting stuck on, you can just make a tiny list of things you need in order to make these events happen. And that's all you need in the world for that first draft. You're welcome. I know you have one.
Unlike many American writers, both of you are at least bilingual, if I'm not mistaken. Am I correct in assuming that for both of you, English was not your native language? Then my question is, how do you think that has affected your English language writing? Are there strengths that you see that your experience with languages gives you that a monolingual writer would not have? Difficulties?
That's a really good question.
That is a really good question. If we're talking about specifically on a prose level, I think the difficulties are fairly straightforward in that sometimes I'm not quite sure, like, wait, what would the most right or natural way to say this be? But at this point, English has also become so naturally to me that those moments are becoming, less and less frequent. On a more macro level, I think being bilingual does help play with language a little bit more, because even if it's something as like certain sayings, knowing certain sayings in English or knowing certain sayings in Dutch and how different they are. Like there's this, there's a saying in Dutch, like if something is complete nonsense, you say, oh, that's like a wrench on a pig, which is complete nonsense, obviously. But those kinds of things that you would not have in English, and all kinds of variations. There are certain words that we have that don't exist in the English language that I think are very nice words, that I would very much like to exist. One of them is, I tend to describe it as the opposite of begrudging something. It means like, I want this person to have this thing. I think they deserve this thing. I think, it would be nice for them to have this thing. So it's a very warm, positive, fuzzy word that you cannot describe in a single word in English because it doesn't exist. And I think having that awareness of the limitations of language and simultaneously the possibilities of language does help you play with it in some ways. And in the more direct ways, my first novel deals with multilingualism, and it's actually a plot point here and there. And I have heard from multiple bilingual readers that they really appreciated that approach because it's not something that you often see. And in this case, it was about some word in the fantasy world, and that ended up being so much more relevant than people thought purely because of the whole bilingual aspects that I can't really explain right now without having to detail the whole novel. But yeah, sometimes it actually has very practical plot consequences.
I guess the one, just to be completely embarrass myself, and the one difficulty that will still occur less and less, but it'll happen at least once in a while, is that I will fuck up a preposition. I can't, like, that's just...
Those
like,
are the worst.
Yes, I just don't, I don't understand, I mean, nobody understands why they are the way they are, right? That unless people do.
We don't understand either.
So that's the difficulty. I have to say that for me, because so much of the stuff that I was reading when I was growing up, I was first 8 years of my life I was in a workers' camp in Venezuela, and it was Venezuelan kids, Colombian kids, Japanese kids, adults too. But and the Americans had like the best toys, and they had people were like sending them tapes of like Saturday morning cartoons, and I was watching them, and they were awesome. So it's like there's this real love affair early on with American culture, right? Especially anything having to do with Star Wars, right? They said like all the American kids had the really big Star Wars toys being shipped off to a. So for me, one of the advantages of being bilingual is there's this real, genuine sort of frustration with the fact that Spanish was all romance. It's purely a romance language, right? Which is it's just a lot of florid, circular, gorgeous. I mean, eventually, like once I sort of like, oh, that is really beautiful. But at first, I was just very frustrated because if you wanted to say anything, it took everybody forever just to get to the point, right? And English has a great deal of Latin romance influence on the one side. It's got this, so it's got everything, right? And so there were multiple ways of getting at an idea in a way that I felt you could not get at in Spanish. But so that's the yeah, that was my those are my thoughts.
I don't quite know. I know what time it is, and I don't know how long we are meant to be going. So I don't.
I mean, this is a natural.
Are we good? Yeah. Okay. Thank you guys for coming to this, and buy their books because their books are amazing.
So buy Maria's books too.
Thank you.
So Christine Alberga just stepped out. Levi is actually going to be here in 2 minutes, but 2 minutes too late. But he will be here to sign some books if people buy some. I hope you do buy some. I do. I don't know if Christine isn't here to receive it. I do want to give her a round of applause. She's
oh
done
yeah.
An extraordinary logistical. questions and was really was an extraordinary help pulling this off. And I just want to thank Maria once again for leading us through this and congratulate the authors on their extraordinary work, and do support them. Read. Everyone should read. So thank you, and hope to see you here next year.